Well, if y'all will look in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we're going to start in about David. And y'all remember what happened? I'll say just a minute, a couple of words about Saul. Remember, God anointed him, had him anointed king, Saul. You know, and he was a good-looking guy. He was taller than everybody in the kingdom. He was strong. He was everything that people would want in a king. But God took the kingdom from him. And why did God take the kingdom from him?
He disobeyed God.
That's right. He disobeyed God. He was disobedient to the Lord, and he turned from him, and pride came up in him. And see, I was reading about him the other day, and I heard a writer say that Saul typifies the Antichrist. And the reason he says that is because, you know, he persecuted David the rest of the time he was alive. You know, he started out enjoying David and being friends with him after he killed Goliath. But he got jealous because David kind of started coming up in the eyes of the people. And so he disobeyed God about destroying the Amalekites, the kingdom. He said he wanted all of them gone, and Saul didn't do it. Not because, you know, of kindness or anything like that, but because of what he could get out of them. You know, they kept the sheep and the cattle and all that stuff. And God told them no, but they did it anyways. And he even used a religious reason, you know. So we kept these animals, you know, to make a sacrifice to the Lord our God. I didn't tell them to do that. My thinking is there was something wrong with them animals. Now, I don't know, but that's just what I'm thinking. Maybe they had diseases or something, or I ain't going to speculate no more on that. But anyhow, bottom line is God told him to do something, and he didn't do it the way the Lord said. And that happened about 2 different times. So God stripped the kingdom from him. And when he did that, it says Samuel grieved over Saul. And God regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So while Samuel was grieving, as we get into this right here, also one thing about Saul, that ought to be a reminder to us too. And I got to thinking about some people I've known over the years that, by all appearances, they were great Christians. You know, they looked like they was really living the life, and some of them I really, really admired, and I looked up to. But you know what? Be very careful about trusting anybody. And I don't mean it to be in a bad way, because we should be able to trust one another. But you know, you got to remember that people are still people, and we've got a sin nature.
Yes, sir.
And you know, I've known some people that I had the utmost respect for, and I would have followed to the ends of the earth, that failed. And you know, it's a horrible thing to have to deal with, and it'll make you question your own salvation. Sometimes it can be so bad. You know what is the point in all this? What's the point in it? You know, if you can't trust somebody like that, who can you trust? But it's like that, and there's examples of it all through history. God may call them, but you know, it's on us to be sure we're obedient to the Lord at all time, and avoid temptations at all time. Because just like Paul said, you know, if any man thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. Because we can fall. We could fall. It's absolutely possible. And if you say you can't, you ain't been in that position yet. You know, because when the temptation gets bad enough. So anyhow, that's what happened to Saul. It's a sad thing, but it happened. And this is what the Lord had to say to Samuel about that. He said, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel?" He said, "It's time to quit mourning about this." He said, "He's rejected. He's not coming back. He's out as king." And he says, "Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." See, Samuel knows now that Saul has bitterness has taken hold of his heart, and it's going to show up for years to come, because he's going to anoint David, but at the same token, it's going to be over a decade before David actually steps onto the throne, maybe closer to 15 years. So even though he's anointed as king, he's not just going to step right up there and put a crown on his head. That's years to come, and he's going to go through a lot during that time, just like we do. We're not David, but when you come to the Lord, you can expect there's going to be trials and tribulations show up. It's going to happen every time. The Lord's going to allow you to be tested. And I bet every one of you here has been saved. I bet you could say that you've been through that during your life. You know, the Lord has tested you to see if you're going to stay faithful or not. Because he's not wanting to use people that can't be faithful to him. He won't do it. He needs people to be faithful. So anyhow, he says, the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" You know, the prophet of the Lord shows up. You know, they know he's the man. And they want to make sure he ain't fixing to come put some kind of pronouncement on them. So they were nervous about it. And Samuel said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Now, I don't really know what that consecration entails. I tried to look it up, but I couldn't really find anything other than like when priests are getting ready to go in the temple or the tabernacle. But it probably consisted of them washing their bodies with water and him saying some words over them or something. I don't know. But it says he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." So I guess Eliab was a big strapping young man who looked like, you know, he ought to be king. And Samuel, in his mind, he was convinced immediately, well, this is the guy right here. The son of Jesse, Eliab, surely this is the Lord's anointed before me. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him." God didn't want him to be king. He had somebody else in mind. He says, "For the Lord sees not as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." That's a very common scripture right there. Many people know it. And it's absolutely true. Here's this young man, you know, according to human standards, you know, he'd be the guy, you know. He was like the quarterback in high school that gets recruited into college. You know, he's just by appearances, he got everything you need. But there was something about Eliab that God didn't like. I don't know what it was in his life, but the Lord rejected him, said, "No, it's not going to be him." God doesn't look on things like that. And just as we serve God, as we got our faith and trust in the Lord, God, he doesn't always choose the high and mighty. And as a matter of fact, he rarely does. You know, He's looking for somebody that he can see down the road that he's going to be faithful to him and be trustworthy. And it's not ever a sure thing, I don't think, because of our natures. But God knew who he wanted, and he didn't want alive. And he said, then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. Okay, here's the youngest son, a young man, probably a teenager. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and he had beautiful eyes and was handsome. So let's look at that just a minute. What does ruddy mean? Yeah, a lot of people say that David had red hair. No.
Mine says he was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features.
Yeah, he looked like a healthy young man. He probably had some sun. He looked a little, red maybe. Maybe he had red hair, maybe he didn't. I've actually seen some pictures of him where old paintings where he had red hair. But whether that's true or not, I don't know, and it don't really matter. He was a good-looking young man. Whereas David said before, as Samuel said before, don't look on the appearance. It didn't go by any of that. He was a good-looking young man. Looked like he might have, the ladies would have had an eye for him. But the Lord didn't automatically reject him because he looked like that. I don't think he was a big strapping young man, but, he was nice looking according to this. And, maybe he didn't look like a king, though. Maybe he didn't look like a king, but I don't know. But anyhow, that was him. The Lord didn't look on his appearance. He could have been ugly. And the Lord said, arise and anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So here is David. He's anointed king, but it's really in private. Saul don't know about it. Nobody knows about it except Samuel and his family, that he's been anointed king. And they don't go around talking about it either. I guess they're waiting for the day that the Lord is going to make him, is going to bring him out of secrecy. But verse 14, it says, now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. A harmful spirit from the Lord. I'm sure he's talking about a demon, actually. But, the way this language is, this spirit, harmful spirit, he was doing what the Lord told him to do. Even devils, and even though they're principalities and powers, in the air and in the world around them, they're at the behest of God, and God will use anything. And he used this particular evil spirit to torment Saul, because Saul was wrong. His mind and his heart was not right with God anymore, and he was being tormented by this thing. In other words, how is that showing up? Probably fits of rage and temper and depression and everything else. Yeah. He probably showed out a lot. He was not happy, and he knew he wasn't right with the Lord. And when he did try to appear to the Lord, the thing about it is, it was all for show. It wasn't it was in a way to make him look good. Always, always. Saul was trying to make himself look good, as we've seen in the other part. So this harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him, and it had a purpose. And Saul's servant said to him, "Behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre." Or, you know what that is, kind of like the hand harp or whatever. "And when the harmful spirit of God from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well." So Saul said to his servants, "Provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me." One of the young men answered, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who was skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." Now I'm wondering right now, maybe some of these young men, they might have been exaggerating about David a little. Now he was a young man of valor. I don't know of him ever being involved in war, but he knew how to hold off the lions, and he knew how to hold off the bears, and that's pretty valorous right there. Ain't everybody going to do that for sheep, but that was his job, and that's what he did. That's what he did. God gave him skill, and we already know he was good with the sling, and he was good with a sword. He could do whatever he needed to do. But he was his father's youngest son. Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David your son, who is with the sheep." And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat, and sent them by David his son to Saul. Then David came to Saul and entered his service. If I bring a gift to Brenda, it ain't going to be a young goat, I promise you that. She don't like goats. But that's a heck of a thing, but it was a big deal to give something like that to a king. He was giving them stuff that they could use.
And Tommy asked me, did I want to go? And I said, nah.
David came to Saul and entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. So God is already using David. See, David has been anointed the king. Saul hasn't processed that the kingdom's been ripped from him. Samuel told him, said, "God has rejected you as king," but Saul's just going on like ain't nothing happened, I'm still the king. And look what happens out of nowhere. David is anointed king by Samuel, and the next thing you know, he's coming down there and playing and singing for the rejected king that he's going to take his place. You don't see that yet. God, when they say the Lord works in mysterious ways, it's true. He really does. That may not be a Bible verse, but it's still true. The Lord works in ways, and you and I can both see probably times in our lives. When we look back, you don't see it at the time, but when you look back, you can say, wow, I see now how the Lord put all this together like he did. He used circumstances, and he used other people to deal with my heart, and put me in the position where I'm at. You can see it. I bet every one of you could tell me a story about that. And so that's what's happening right here with David. He's going to Saul, and he goes into Saul's service. That's pretty wild, ain't it? But what time is it? So what's next? Chapter 17. The Israelites, they were always at war with the Philistines. Always at war. And pretty much for a long time, they had been the losers for most of it. They were in constant battle with one another, and constant fighting. And usually the Philistines had the upper hand on them. Judges, before the kings came, they couldn't even have swords. The Philistines wouldn't allow it. And they had to go to the Philistines to get their tools sharpened to farm with. You know, they had to get all that done. They wouldn't let them have anything that would give them swords. They were pretty well kind of a dictatorship over them, which was not to be. It says in 17:1, now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, which equals out to over 9 feet. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, which I don't remember right now how much that was, but it was a lot.
So between 150 and 200 pounds.
So he had all probably a close to 200-pound coat of mail that he wore. Just imagine toting that around. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head was weighed 600 shekels of iron, which is what?
Shekel is 2/5 of an ounce.
Yeah. Can you see how much it was, Jamie?
15 to 20 pounds.
Okay. So the spear's head was 15 to 20 pounds. And the shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and service. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They feared him. They didn't want to go out to fight him. Every one of them knew that in their heads that they were not capable of beating this man, and that he was going to kill them and then probably mutilate their bodies. They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to take that chance. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn. You remember who he was. He's the one God told Samuel, said, don't look on him, because of his stature. He would be the most probable who would go out and fight against Goliath, but he didn't do it. Eliab didn't go. None of them went. And so for 40 days the Philistine came forward and took a stand morning and evening. So even though David was still in service to Saul, he was also still looking after the sheep. And Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers some of this parched grain and 10 loaves of bread, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. So he's sending David to see if everybody's okay, and sending food for the king and the people in the army. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment of the host and was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with the great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down, and with whom have you left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Now see, Eliab has already got jealous. He's already watched his youngest brother get anointed by Saul to be the king. And he ain't accepting it either. He's got a lot of pride in his heart right here. And, ma'am?
My Bible says pride.
Yeah, he's full of pride. He's full of pride. And he's accusing David of coming down here, and he just wants to come down and see what's going on. And then David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? You know, he ain't done nothing wrong. He just wants to know what's going on. And he had delivered them from, he had been being obedient to his father. That's why he came down. So Eliab didn't know what he's talking about. He turned and went away from him toward another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him as before. When the words of David were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. Now, I imagine Saul and those around him, they probably laughed. Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. And David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. If he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And so Saul told him, go and the Lord be with you. So this is a young man right here where it said the Holy Spirit come upon him when he was anointed. The Lord was speaking to his heart and telling him, you can do this. I'm going to be with you. That's where his courage came from. His courage didn't come from himself. His courage came from the Lord, because the Lord knew what he was going to do. He already had it in mind what was about to happen. So God trusted, or David trusted him, and the Lord trusted David to follow through with it. That's why he chose David. That's why he chose him to be king. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. So David couldn't even walk around in that stuff. It was probably too big for him to start with, and he wasn't used to wearing stuff like that. He put them off. Then he took a staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David and his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. He can't believe they set this young man out there like that. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into his hand." So if the battle is the Lord's, he don't care what you have. You know, they can come against him with all that, but God knows how to defeat an enemy. And this is going to happen many times in David's life in the future. He's going to happen. God's going to intervene on his behalf many, many times. So when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. Now just think about this now, how God works. This guy had on all this armor, even had a huge bronze helmet that, you know, we probably couldn't wear. You know, it'd probably make us fall down if we attempted to put it on. But God found a spot that wasn't covered, and he put that stone right there, right between the eyes. And he said David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it, and it struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Just like that. Just like that, God can take down anyone or anybody that's against him.
You probably didn't think it, throw a rock, you got to be pretty close anyway.
Yeah.
With a sling, so
Oh, yeah.
coming toward David and said David ran to him and probably caught him by surprise.
That's right. Yeah, David came at him. He didn't stand back there and wait. He came at him. And so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sheraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." So anybody got anything they want to say about this?
It'll make you want to fight the world with us.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
Work.
Yeah.
Imagine how big his head was.
Oh, yeah.
He was 9'9".
Yeah.
Oh, that had to be a big-headed man.
What we can do
He kept carrying
with
it
the
around.
Lord.
Huh?
Kept carrying it around. You know?
His trophy.
I guess so.
Done a lot more reading than commentary, but you know, most of it just speaks for itself. This is a guy, as I said, Saul, he was typified for the Antichrist, and now here's David serving Saul, and David is actually the king now. He hasn't come into his own as of yet. Saul don't know that this young man that just killed Goliath, he's the king.
King David,
Oh,
son
yeah.
of Jesse.
Yeah, that's right.
Seed of Jesus.
That's who he is, you know. And he showed out this day on, the Lord poured out his Spirit on him. And, you know, he was the least one in that group of men you would think would go out against Goliath. No armor, no sword. He had rocks, you know, maybe a staff. But he had rocks.
Probably brought his rocks this morning.
Yeah. 5 smooth stones.
One thing I found very interesting,
Take the life of Brother Ross. I mean,
That talking about where the battle is the Lord's, man, that wraps all around every one of us.
Oh, yeah.
And each one of our individual lives, our church life, and our country's life, God's still in control.
You know, Brother Rusty, you know, CR's got a lot of problems right now. A lot of our CR family is struggling.
Yeah.
A lot of them, a bunch.
Yeah.
But, you know, I can't save them.
No,
I can't fix them. I can love them and share the gospel.
that's right.
And I can pray for them, and God can fight that battle.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, you know, God fought this battle right here. That was him.
Yes.
You know, we give praise to David, but everything David got, he got from the Lord. You know, the courage, that was God's chosen vessel. And David would go on to become king, and just remember all these learning times that David, when he was keeping the sheep, you know, that was an all day, all night thing, in the weather, all of that. But a lot of these psalms he wrote during that time, you know, he was a musician, a young man, but he was a musician. He prayed to the Lord. He was doing a lot of praying in them nights. A lot of praying, getting to know the Lord. And God ordained him to be king. We're not David, but God calls us a lot of times through things, you know, and if we be faithful to him and pray and seek him, you know, they ain't no telling what the Lord will do through us, you know. David had a lot of faults, and he sinned in a lot of ways, but God never rejected him as king, because God knew his nature, God knew his heart. He sinned. Saul sinned, and Saul got rejected from being king. But it's different. You know, the Lord said, David is a man after my own heart. And he kept him, even though he had sinned. You know, he, as we'll see later on, he gets confronted with the sins. And he don't make excuses like Saul did. You know, we're going to see a lot of that. He's not going to say, we did this, you know, because, you know, we're going to give more glory to the Lord later or something. But, you know, David would do exactly what the Lord told him to do. And he would own it. He would say, I have sinned, you know, and not make excuses. And he would repent. And he'd suffer the consequences too, but God never removed him as the king. He was a type of Christ. He was pointing the way through all his Psalms, through his whole life. You read some of those Psalms, you know, and he was a prophet. God considered him a prophet, a priest, and a potentate, just like Jesus is. You know, Jesus is our high priest. Jesus was a prophet, and Jesus is the King of Kings. And David, every bit of that pointed to Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ would come from him. He would come from the line of David.
Yes.
a wonderful thing to think about and get a hold of. Anybody else got anything? Some more interesting stuff coming up in here. David and Jonathan, and David gets married to Saul's daughter, and Saul really starts getting put out with David, and gets to the point where he starts trying to kill him. That's just like why he's a type of the Antichrist. You know, the Antichrist, he wants to, when he comes into the world, he's going to want to destroy the name of Christ. He wants to destroy Christ. You know, he'll never be able to do it, but he's gonna kill his people and persecute them for sure. Y'all got anything to pray about tonight? Let's pray for our church. If we don't do nothing else, pray
Pray
for.
for my sister, because she's a little better, but not a lot.
All right, she's still in the hospital.
She's been there a long time, hasn't she?
Well, she come home and had to go back. She's been there another week this time.
All right. Brenda, will you pray us out, please?
Dear Father, thank you so much for this day you've given us. Father, thank you that we've had the opportunity to be in your house and listen to your word being read, and you speaking to us through that, Father. Just thank you for the message tonight, Father, that reminds us that the battle is yours. We don't have to fight this. All we have to do is trust you, and you're going to fight these battles for us. But the word is we've got to trust and we've got to believe. And I pray you just help us to remember that. Be with us now as we leave, Father. Be with those who may have prayers on their hearts,